Okay, so hey, thanks to everybody for coming. This is the third term of the seminar series for the Institute for the Study of Political Economy and Law. We're really happy today. We have Professor Bill Bowring. Everyone knows him. He's from Birkbeck University. British legal theorist, commentator, human rights expert, advocate on minority rights, human rights, you name it. And he's going to be talking today about revolutionary conservatism.
No, the resurgence of radical conservatism.
Radical conservatism in Russia.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Bill, thanks.
Okay, good evening. I know a couple of you already, so how many people here speak Russian? I was wondering. Okay, я могу говорить по-русски, но я считаю, что перевод обратно на английский был бы, so I'll speak in English, if that's all right with you. But I can answer questions in either, so whatever you prefer. You've been working really hard today. You've been listening to Nina Belyaeva and Peter Torgner. So, right, okay, so that is indeed working very hard. So you'll have to forgive me a little bit because I had to start at 3 o'clock this morning in order to get here, and having been up rather late last night, so I've been leaving things on my glasses all over both buildings. I'm finally reunited with the glasses, thank goodness. It would be difficult otherwise. I'm not going to read you a lecture. I did actually watch my former student Akbar Rasulov's lecture on the video here. When he was my student, he was already terrifying. And he read you quite a lecture, didn't he? I thought the questions were interesting too. He is, one of the most brilliant people of his generation, without doubt, but also, fast delivery and very complex ideas. And John has not been my student. Anyone here been my student as such? So, Nina Belyaeva, who you've met, I've been working with her just recently in Russia. Just a few words of background. I've been going to Russia since 1983 and speaking Russian since the mid-80s and involved in a lot of different things there. And this is one of my kind of central interests, and I'm presently involved in 2 big projects in Russia, but I can answer questions about that later. The main thing which I'm presently doing since the year 2002 is a project called the European Human Rights Advocacy Centre, ECRAC. Don't say Iraq, because that gets confusing. ECRAC employs 12 people in Russia. It works with the human rights NGO Memorial. And what we've been doing since 2002 is taking several hundred cases against Russia, of which we've won about 60, and about half of them to do with Chechnya. We won 2 more disappearance and killing cases today, in fact, so every day there are new judgments coming through. And the other cases include environmental cases, discrimination, consequences of nuclear catastrophes, quite a number of things. And prior to that, in the 1990s, I was taking a lot of cases against Turkey at the European Court of Human Rights, so from 1992 till the beginning of the 2000s. And these were representing Kurds against Turkey. So that was what really got me into human rights practice. And since then, what I've been worrying about constantly is what actually this means in a variety of different ways. So I think that human rights are highly problematic as part of international law, which is itself highly problematic, and that the practice raises all sorts of questions. Now, I have brought some flyers for my book that came out 2 years ago, which it's had good reviews. The first tirage, first print sold out, so it was reprinted. And it's called The Degradation of the International Legal Order, question mark, the rehabilitation of law and the possibility of politics. And quite a lot of it is analysis and reflection on what it means to be involved in this kind of practice. And I started at Birkbeck College. Birkbeck is known as a centre for theoretical critique of law, and you have people there like Peter Fitzpatrick and Costas Douzinas and so on. You might have come across their writings. And I was appointed professor there about 8 years ago now, but in many ways so as to provide a bridge to practical experience. I understand one of the things happening here soon is a clinic, so I was discussing that this afternoon. I'm now on study leave at the University of Essex, where I was teaching for 4 years. That's where Akbar Rasulov was my student. And I have another contract from Routledge, and the new book is on law, rights, and ideology in Russia. And so I will come in a few minutes to what will be a chapter in the book. Just to give a little bit of background, Russia is often presented as being a place of legal nihilism. There are many writers who have said that in Russia, religion takes the place of politics, and there's certainly a very strong strand in Russian political thinking, which is called Byzantinism. And one of the leading exponents was a man called Leontiev at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, who wrote a famous article, "What is Liberalism and Why it is Dangerous for Us?" And the thesis of the Byzantinists is that, and for heaven's sake, Byzantium is the only 1,000-year Reich known, I think, to human history. It did last 1,000 years. And the Byzantinists would say the secret of its success was the union of church and state. And you have a very strong tradition in Russia of what is called Messianism, and that is the messianic role of Russia in the world. So Russia as it started in Moscow, Russia as the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and this continues today. This is connected with the idea of Russia as the Third Rome, and that was after the fall of Constantinople to the Muslims. And so Russia, Moscow was going to be and is still thought to be the Third Rome. And this also plays out in a theory called Eurasianism, of whom the leading exponent is a man called Alexander Dugin, who's now a professor at Moscow State University. He looks rather impressive. He has a large beard. And he's made a transition over the past 10, 15 years from somebody who started off as a neo-fascist thinker. So he was the main ideologist for Eduard Limonov, the present leader of the National Bolsheviks. And so the original ideology, closely linked to occultism, was the ideology of the so-called left Nazis before the Night of the Long Knives. Peter Strasser, Roma, the SA thinkers, so extreme nationalists. Dugin has moved over the years, and his present position is Eurasianist. This is linked with the fact that officially in Russia you have 4 religions by law, 4 official religions of Russia: Orthodoxy, Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism. And so the idea of Eurasianism is that Russia is the spiritual pole, uniting the 4 religions across the European and Asian continents, in opposition to Western consumerism, materialism, and decadence. And so this is, you can see how all these kind of ideas fit together. This has been a very strong tendency in Russian law as well, so it's closely linked with the idea of the emperor as autocrat, to the idea that representation, individualism, parliamentary democracy are dangerous. And you can see aspects of this with Putin and the people around him today, which I'll come to in a moment. So, first question is this the only tendency in Russian history? The answer to that is not. And there's a strong liberal democratic individualist tendency in Russia. This is quite often presented in the literature as an intellectual struggle between Slavophiles and Westernizers. There's another word, podsveniki, so people who organically draw from the Russian soil. And my colleague, Nina's colleague in Moscow, Olga Marinova, has written very well about this in Russian, and she's published in English also, on the question of Russian identity also. The other side to the story, which this is like a footnote in a way, but I find it very interesting, is the 18th century in Russia, at the time of the Enlightenment, and there are a number of Enlightenments, of course. Catherine the Great, you may know this, she not only corresponded with Voltaire, but she invited Diderot to come and stay with her in St. Petersburg and conducted a whole series of discussions with him. If you don't know Denis Diderot, he's a leading philosopher of the French Enlightenment, a ruthless materialist and determinist. He wrote a fantastic book called Jacques le Fataliste, Jacques the Fatalist, so he was a determinist. Rigorous. It's a very funny book also. So he was there in Catherine's court. And during Catherine's reign, the first full professor of law in Russia was a man called Semyon Desnitsky, who spent 6 years in Glasgow in the 18th century, studied under Adam Smith, and actually defended his dissertation in civil law, supervised by Adam Smith. So that's the period of the Scottish Enlightenment. David Hume, Adam Smith, Hutchinson, these kind of people. When Scotland had a very distinct intellectual revolution, as it were, in contrast to England at that time. Desnitsky was in Scotland for 6 years. When he returned to Russia, he was involved in translations of the work of Smith and others. Some really founded law as an academic discipline in Russia. And I personally think that law is very strong in Russia, as a matter of fact. It's often portrayed as not being the case, but I think it's a very strong discipline. And he also prepared, during Catherine's lifetime, a proposal for abolition of serfdom in Russia, and a proposal for a constitutional monarchy in Russia. Catherine was sympathetic, but thought it was premature, and she was probably right. And he died in his bed in 1789. So you all know which year that was. It was the French Revolution. So you can see kind of strong connections in many ways. And this period in the 18th century, not very many years later, after the Napoleonic Wars, 1825, the Decembrist movement, which was put down very fiercely, but for a constitutional monarchy in Russia. And after Russia was defeated in the Crimean War, Alexander II became emperor, and 1861 he abolished serfdom, 5 or 6 years ahead of the Americans abolishing slavery. So Russians were always very, very pleased to hear this, that Russia was ahead. And 1864, Alexander II's great reforms in the legal sphere. So you had the institution of jury trial throughout the Russian Empire. You also had really independent judges. You had the abolition of most of the powers of the prosecutor's office, so they became the people who prosecuted in court rather than the Tsar's eyes in every sphere of life. And the institution of justices of the peace. So 1864, a real watershed, and if you like, a dramatically, so Russia itself, as a result of defeating the war, deciding that these kind of radical reforms were needed. And those reforms really continued through to the Bolshevik Revolution. One of the people I'm studying at the moment, I can answer questions if you're interested, is Yevgeny Plashikanis. And what you will find in my book, if you look at it, is a debate between me and China Mieville, who wrote a book called Between Equal Rights, on a Marxist theory of international law based on Plashikanis. So we have some disagreements about that. Robert Knox, I have an ongoing debate with. I'm not talking about that this evening, that will be in the book, in the new book, in detail. But the thesis there is that actually there was a lot more law around in the Soviet period than one is generally led to believe. And furthermore, what's been happening in Russia since the collapse of communism, since the collapse of the former Soviet Union? So, for example, Russia's accession to the Council of Europe in 1996 and ratification of the European Convention on Human Rights in 1998. These are not transplants from outside of alien concepts and ideas and materials, mechanisms into Russia. This is a restoration of what was going on in the 19th century. So you've had some very strange phenomena, like Putin, for example, in the period when he first became acting president, up until 2003 when he had Khodorkovsky arrested. That was really the end of the reform period. He was talking about dictatorship of law, and he was also referring to the great reforming judge and jurist of the late 19th century, R.F. Connie. And R.F. Connie, by the way, as a footnote, he was the judge who presided over the trial of the revolutionary Vera Zasulich. She was a leading revolutionary right through to the Bolshevik Revolution. She shot the governor of St. Petersburg, Trepov, in broad daylight in front of many witnesses, intending to kill him. Didn't kill him quite, seriously wounded him. She was obviously charged with attempted murder, but it was a jury trial. There was an attempt to pressurize Connie before the trial, and the Ministry of Justice got onto him and said, look, you're going to do your duty by the state, aren't you? He said, no, I'm going to do my duty by justice. And he directed the jury, obviously, that she had committed a crime, but her defense was that she had every right to try to kill Trepov because of the terrible crimes he had committed himself. And the jury acquitted her. And she went on to be a leading revolutionary. Nothing happened to Connie, and he became a leading legal reformer. As far as I know, nothing happened to the members of the jury. So even though Russia at that time was an autocracy, the legal reforms of that period were real. So I just mentioned a second ago, 2003, a watershed. By the way, today, the Moscow City Court has rejected the appeal of Khodorkovsky and Lebedev in their second trial. So the first trial, we will soon have a judgment from the European Court of Human Rights. Almost certainly will say that this was a politically motivated and absolutely unfair trial. The second trial, they were charged with stealing more money than there actually is in Russia. So it was it was the same charges as the first time round, but mad. Just expanded beyond belief. I don't know if people heard this, but the Judge Danielkin, for the second trial, former police investigator, like many judges in Russia, but not a bad judge. Many people say he's actually one of the better criminal judges. You may know, you may not know that the acquittal rate in ordinary Russian courts is 0.4%. 0.4. Where you have a jury trial, you have 18% perhaps. This was not a jury trial for Khodorkovsky and Lebedev. Danielkin was due to give his judgment on the 15th of December. When people turned up at the court, there was a handwritten notice on the door saying, please come back on the 27th of December. During that period, he was seen being taken by a number of chaps in suits to the Moscow City Court. And when he read the judgment on the 27th, he read it in a monotone. You couldn't really hear what he was saying. And he read several pages that were completely extraneous, so he wasn't paying attention to what he was reading. And it now seems that he was almost certainly doing that deliberately to try and keep a bit of self-respect. Because recently, his assistant at the court, Miss Belyaeva, has gone public that actually he was reading a judgment that was given to him. He was reading a judgment that was given to him, and therefore wanted to make it clear that it was not his own work. By the way, the judges in Russia frequently don't write their own judgment, they simply read out the indictment. And there was a bit of a scandal a year or so ago because it was found that they were reading out the indictment with grammatical errors included. So they weren't even correcting the grammatical errors of the, so it's a bad situation. And even President Medvedev frequently uses the phrase legal nihilism himself to describe the situation in Russia. So he freely speaks about endemic corruption. It is reckoned that Putin has, 40 billion, something like that, sorted away in foreign bank accounts. And Medvedev certainly has and the general view in Russia is this is expected. Why would you want to be president or prime minister if you weren't going to put away serious sums of money? So I think things at present are pretty well as bad as they could be. I'm asked questions about that. So the central topic, the resurgence of radical conservatism. What got me thinking initially was the ideology of the regime. So you think, what is the ideology of the Putin regime? Of course, part of it is to hang on to power at all costs. So this is a regime that has to stay in power, not least because if they lose power, they will be prosecuted. And people will find where the money has gone. Putin originally became president on the stroke of midnight 1999. His first job was to issue a degree of immunity for Yeltsin, for the Yeltsin family, and that's what he did. So, Yeltsin died without having been prosecuted, and I think his family has still got that money. So it is that kind of a thing. So is it simply kleptocracy? This is a word that's frequently used. It's a regime based on stealing, and what they did with the UCOS money when they arrested Khodorkovsky, smashed up UCOS, was to use it for paying all the levels of the system that you need to pay. The really prosperous people in Russia these days are bureaucrats who are called chinovniki to this day. Chin, that's from the Tsarist word for the table of ranks, where if you rose in the civil service, you became an aristocrat, like Lenin's father. Lenin was a hereditary aristocrat all the way through his father. In his passport it said aristocrat, though he was an unusual one. The ideology of the present regime is called sovereign democracy. And so this looks quite bland. These are two sovereign, this is a normal word in international law, you come across it all the time. Democracy, that's a really nice word, isn't it? So you put the two together, you've got sovereign democracy. So the attitude of many commentators in the West is that this is actually just meaningless, that this is some kind of an attempt at window dressing. And the thesis I want to outline now is that there is an awful lot more to it, actually. And most people in the West are not aware of this. And it actually is something one needs to take care of. Sovereign democracy was dreamed up by the young chap who's the ideologist of the regime. I said youngish, he's born in 1964. So compared with some of the others, he's called Vladislav Yuryevich Surkov, and he is a pretty evil-looking character, actually. So if you Google him, you'll see his picture. And he's the deputy head of the president's administration. So he's in Medvedev's office, but he's definitely Putin's man. And in 2006, he contributed to a collection called Sovereignty, Suverenitet, edited by one of the young conservatives, Nikita Karajan. So I'll say more about that in a moment. You can watch them on YouTube, by the way. If you have the Russian language, put these characters into YouTube, and you can, like this, so I'm being filmed now, and you can watch them speaking at seminars and round tables that they have attended. And you get a pretty good idea where it is that they're coming from. And so one of my starting points is that they are the contemporary representatives of the Messianism, of the Eurasianism, of these ideas of Russia's special role in the world, to save the world, as it were, these are people following those traditions, but with a very surprising addition. So Putin had a chapter in this book, Sovereignty, Medvedev had a chapter, Surkov, and a number of these young conservatives. And I think it's a key book for understanding what is going on in that regime. Surkov himself has published a volume called Texts, which is his main contributions, roundtable meetings and that kind of thing, over a 10-year period where he's been working out this ideology. One of the things which really got me thinking about this was on the 29th of October last year. Now, the best court in Russia for a long time was the Constitutional Court. So its predecessor was founded by Gorbachev in the Perestroika period. It functioned after the collapse of the Soviet Union up until 2003. 2003 was when Yeltsin shelled the Russian parliament. He brought the tanks in, tore up the existing constitution, and the Constitutional Court, to their credit, sat all night, declared what Yeltsin had done to be illegal, unconstitutional, and were promptly suspended. So they were suspended, the court didn't sit for 2.5 years. The chairman of the court at that time was Valery Zorkin, who was a communist, I think he still is in many ways, communist. And Zorkin is now once more the chairman of the Constitutional Court. The Russian Constitutional Court is based on Karlsruhe, the German Constitutional Court, and the judges spend a lot of time in Germany, German judges come all the time. Actually, the Russian legal system, the system of civil and criminal codes, is basically the German system, though the civil codes were drafted by Dutch experts from Leiden. Actually, not at all a bad civil code, as it happens. So Zorkin, 29th of October last year, wrote a big article in the Rossiyskaya Gazeta, which is the official government newspaper, and the article is called Предели уступчивости. So the limits of tolerance. And basically, Zorkin is very angry indeed with the European Court of Human Rights. And two cases in particular have really got him going. First one is called Markin against Russia, and that's a case on discrimination, though it's a man who's being discriminated against. By the way, the Grand Chamber hearing is coming up very shortly, so you can watch it on the podcast on the Council of Europe site. Why was Zorkin so angry about Markin against Russia? Because for the first time, the European Court strongly criticised the Russian Constitutional Court, of which Zorkin is the chairman. He said, actually, the Russian Constitutional Court takes precedence over the European Court of Human Rights. It is the guardian of the Russian Constitution. And he says, I am not doing anything new. There is a precedent, the case of Gyurglu in the German Verfassungsgericht, German Constitutional Court, very famous case 2 years back, where the German Constitutional Court indeed considered the relationship between the German Constitution and the European Convention on Human Rights. So Zorkin says, I'm simply following a German precedent. I'm not doing anything unusual. The other case he was very angry about was the case of the so-called United Opposition. This is from the elections in 2003. And there are a series of cases now coming through. The European Court is very slow. It's appallingly slow. The case takes between 6 and 12 years to get through to a judgment. So the United Opposition case from 2003 has just been communicated to Russia. That's the first stage. By the way, there are 151,000 cases pending in Strasbourg now. Nearly 50,000 of them from Russia. The majority of these cases will never, ever be heard. They're just pouring in. Some of them do get communicated and do get heard. This one has taken the usual amount of time. What Zorkin finds absolutely appalling is that this is challenging Russia's very political foundations. And in fact, after he wrote his article, there was another victory against Russia. This is the case of the Republican Party against Russia. This is Mr. Ryzhikov, who is a leading opposition figure in Russia. So he's won his case that the Republican Party did not have a fair election in 2003. So there's a number of these cases coming through. So Zorkin is furious. I thought, let me just give you an idea. So he writes in this article, the principles of state sovereignty and the supremacy of the constitution in the legal system of Russia lie at the foundation of its constitutional system. The European Convention, as an international treaty of Russia, is a component part of its legal system, but is not higher than the constitution. Each decision of the European Court is not only a legal but a political act. There's my words in mind. When such a decision is taken in the interest of the protection of the rights and freedoms of the citizen and the development of our country, Russia will always precisely obey it. When a decision is doubtful from the point of view of the goal of the European Convention, and moreover, in a direct fashion concerns national sovereignty, Russia has the right to work out a defense mechanism against such decisions. And he goes on, like any other European state, Russia must fight as much for the preservation of its sovereignty as for the careful relationship with the European Convention and defence of its sovereignty against inadequate, doubtful decisions. So the word sovereignty appeared 4 times in that short passage. And if you read the whole article, you know, there's a kind of machine there at work, turning out the word sovereignty. In the immediate aftermath to that, there was a head-to-head with Jean-Paul Costa in St. Petersburg. Jean-Paul Costa is the president of the European Court of Human Rights. The new German judge at Strasbourg, Angelika Nussberger, was there and said to Zorkin, I'm sorry, you have misread Yurgulu. It says nothing of the kind. And actually Germany punctiliously obeys the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. So that was part of what was going on. Then I did some searches, and I discovered that at the same time that the book on sovereignty came out, with Putin, Medvedev, Surkov, and all these people, he took part in a roundtable. In fact, he led a roundtable called The Sovereign State in Conditions of Globalization, Democracy and National Identity. So you have a torrent of books and articles being produced in Russia on national identity. That is a major topic, as well as sovereignty and even sovereign democracy. At this roundtable, I can tell you the names so if anyone's interested, but a lot of the really leading conservative, more or less right-wing intellectuals in Russia. And that followed a big article by Zorkin in 2004 called Apology for the Westphalian System. And Zorkin's kind of concluding remarks were, from this point of view, Russian democracy is sovereign, and the sovereignty of the Russian state is democratic. So note, please, the definition of the word democratic. It doesn't mean quite what you thought it meant in this sort of discourse. And he says, precisely for this reason, in the globalizing world, the defense of the interests of the state demands the uniting and not the breaking up of sovereignties. Okay. So, the other thing that really got me curious about this, I don't know if anyone sees the journal Radical Philosophy. Radical Philosophy is a radical philosophy journal. So, and it's taken to be a left-wing journal or a radical progressive type of journal. And it's where you will find a lot of very interesting writing on the sort of people you're all interested in. You've just been hearing about Synoptis Luma and Derrida, Levinas, Agamben, etc., etc. So they're all there in radical philosophy. And at the beginning of last year, there was an article called Sovereign Democracy, Dictatorship over Capitalism in Contemporary Russia. I'll repeat that, so it's significant. It's called Sovereign Democracy, Dictatorship over Capitalism in Contemporary Russia. It's written by a woman called Julia Svetlichnaya and a chap called James Hartfield. James Hartfield is somebody who was a leading member of the Revolutionary Communist Party in England. That was one of the England is famous for sectarianism and very small Trotskyist groups, and this was one of them. They are now called the Institute of Ideas, and they are quite influential radical libertarians. So that's James Hartfield. Julia Sketlichny is a research student of Chantal Mouffe. So has anyone here heard of Chantal Mouffe? You've heard of everything. So Chantal Mouffe is at Westminster, where Günter Teubner frequently appears. Because Westminster, by the way, Westminster, with the current assault on higher education in Britain, they have 60 members of staff, 10 of them will be sacked in the near future. This is happening. They don't know which 10, so everybody there is living in fear of the top. In the law school at Westminster, my previous university, London Metropolitan University, they are closing down all of the arts and humanities. Philosophy, which was very good there as well, in fact, Kate Sober and people like that. Anyway, so Julia Sketlichny is Chantal Mouffe's PhD student. Chantal Mouffe was a leading left progressive writer with Ernesto Laclau, and they published a number of things together. Then she became a leading theorist of Carl Schmitt. So Carl Schmitt makes his appearance, he makes some further appearances. This article, January, February 2010, this was precisely on this book, Souveraineté. I should mention Julia Sketlichny. She became quite famous because, anyone here remember the murder in London of Alexander Litvinenko, who was murdered with radioactive polonium by a man called Lugovoy, who with his friend Kovtun, and they took radioactive polonium all over Europe, leaving traces of it all over the shop. Definitely murdered Litvinenko with it. He died a horrible death. It would have been the perfect murder, because it's very hard to trace. Litvinenko was in hospital for 2 weeks before he died, in the best hospital in London. They could not find what it was that was killing him. Until in fact after he died, then they found out what it was. I don't know if you know, but Lugovoy is back in Russia, and he's a member, he's a deputy, he's a member of parliament in the party of Mr. Zhirinovsky, the leader of the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, which is the extreme nationalist party of Russia. So he's got immunity, basically. And he can't be extradited because the Russian constitution, Article 61, you can't extradite your own nationals, which is normal, by the way. So, there he is. I'm presently representing his widow at the European Court of Human Rights, Marina Litvinenko, and that case was communicated in December. We will have, in a few days' time, well, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, Russia's reply to our application. We are basically saying we have no evidence that Putin actually ordered it. It would be hard to get that evidence. What we have got, though, is the fact that you can only get this polonium from one state factory in Russia. So basically, he could only have got the stuff. So he must have said to somebody very high up, look, I'm planning to go and knock off Sasha Litvinenko. Can I have some of this nice polonium? This would have had to come from very high up. So yes, go ahead. So our case against Russia is complicity in the murder. Julia Sketlichny, at the time, was part of what, I have to be careful here, because if anyone is taking notes on her behalf, she's very litigious, and she's sued a number of people already. But it looked very much like a spoiling campaign on behalf of the Kremlin at the time, so it's all quite complicated. I invited her out for coffee, by the way, just to see what sort of person she was, and she was quite nice to talk to. But this article is, I think, quite bizarre. And so, what the authors of this article say is that the collection, Souveraineté, published in 2006, is rooted theoretically in Francois Guizot's political rationalism and Carl Schmitt's decisionism, and endorses their contempt towards key concepts of the liberal democratic age. The new Russian theorists of sovereign democracy prefer instead to understand democracy as an identity of the governors and governed. This goes back to Tsarism, where you had concepts like sabornost, hard to translate into English. Anyway, it more or less has that meaning. It goes back to Byzantium, by the way, so this idea of the state as integrally including everybody on a kind of mystical basis. They cite a bright chap called Makarevich, who wrote that Putin's reforms, in a sense, rely on the logic of Carl Schmitt. Both understand the core of the problems to lie in the fact that the state is turning into one among many institutions, groups and associations. As a result, is in a relation of dependency on other institutions. A relativization of the state takes place. It has to take part in discussions, conclude formal or informal agreements with other instances which claim political status. As a result, the state becomes derivative on the interrelation of forces between conflicting group interests, and the central power becomes in the end only an arbiter or peacemaker. And he goes on, the paradoxical nature of Putin's answer to the Schmittian problem lies in the fact that with the help of depoliticized methods, so pay attention, it's quite interesting, with the help of depoliticized methods, he tries to resolve the political, in their foundations, problems of the restoration of the subjectivity of the state. So, I think that's actually quite a smart insight. And he goes on, then again, this means to speak the language of Schmitt, the question of norm or exception. This is the question which is still completely open for evaluation. And in Russia now, Zizek has been translated into Russian by a lot of people, and so he cites Muth, Zizek, Agamben, Schmitt, and others. What really troubled me initially was in this article in Radical Philosophy, Schmitt makes a completely unproblematic appearance. So in my own book, I'm very critical of my colleague Kostas Douzinas' recent book, Human Rights and Empire, because Schmitt appears constantly in that book, and actually more times than you find in the index, strange enough, so there's more Schmitt than first appears. And this is Schmitt as an authority, as Schmitt says. So I take it everybody in this room knows who Schmitt was. So he was a Nazi. So you can still be an important thinker and a Nazi, and I think he is an important thinker, and I've read, certainly, I think I've read everything that's in English. But I think you still have to contextualize him. I really don't believe in taking important political philosophers as if they had dropped from the sky, you know, with no context. So I think contextualization is quite important. And there's a book I like very much, Hans Werner Muller's book, A Dangerous Mind. I think it's a really good book. It's not a rant, but it's a very careful analysis of what Schmitt was up to after the Second World War, because he wasn't punished, in my opinion, he should have been. But he got away with it, even though he was the leading Nazi legal theorist. And he continued to be, after the war until his death, quite a long way on, a leading chap in fascist Spain and fascist Portugal, and in this wonderful country where we now are. So he was very close to the extreme right of neo-fascists in Italy, where he had a lot of friends. And he's, what I find very strange with Schmitt, so maybe we have some Schmittians in this room, if so, let's argue. But if you know the journal Telos in the United States, it was a kind of left-wing progressive journal. It's now become the leading Schmittian journal. Telos Press published the translations of Schmitt's books. And, you know, Schmitt has become very sexy in British academia, probably elsewhere too. So at Birkbeck, where we are very theoretical, we're not all Schmittians by any means, but, you know, there are quite a few, and we have lots of PhD students doing PhDs on aspects of sovereignty. So I think, you know, this is, I personally find this quite interesting. Kostas loves a book called Sovereignty and Its Discontents, on the primacy of conflict and the structure of the political, by William Rasch, R-A-S-C-H. It's published by the Birkbeck Law Press. So Kostas got it published. That is a totally Schmittian book. So you can tell from the title it has all the Schmittian buzzwords, conflict and so on and so forth. Now, a key chapter in the 2006 book, which I referred to right at the beginning, Sovereignty, is by somebody called Alexander Filipov. Now, Nina Belyaeva was supposed to come back and do this lecture, so I'll have to tell her. They went for coffee and they were supposed to come back. So I was keeping this bit for her, actually. So, because Nina is not a Schmittian at all, but she is somebody who is, patriotic Russian thinker in political terms. And the chap who has an interesting chapter in the sovereignty collection, Alexander Filipov, he is now the head of the chair of practical philosophy at the Higher School of Economics, where Nina is as well. And Filipov, born in 1958, actually for 6 years he was Dean of Sociology at the Moscow Higher School of Social and Economic Science, which is the outfit set up by Manchester University in Moscow as a kind of London School of Economics variant. And Filipov's article is called Sovereignty as a Political Choice. Sovereignty is, now that is totally Schmitt. So then I was moved to follow this up a bit further. And this is somebody, now again I think with this afternoon. So Filipov, he started off as a scholar of Luhmann. So autopoiesis, what Günther Teubner, I imagine, was talking to you about. And so he did his doctorate on Luhmann, but since then has moved to Schmitt. And he's published Schmitt's Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy from 1923. He's done some other translations, and he's published a lot of works explaining Schmitt for the Russian audience. And so his chapter in the Sovereignty book with Putin, Medvedev, and the rest of them, Sukhov, is absolutely peppered with Schmitt, as you would imagine, of course, from the title. So his chapter, Sovereignty as a Political Choice, starts with the question, do we live in a sovereign state? This is the kind of thing that Russians worry about endlessly, along with what is the identity of Russians. So it's a bit like the British have. By the way, I'm American, so I can talk about this freely. Both my friends are American. In Britain, we have now a very ideological extremist government, where a lot of the discourse has to do with what is it to be British, having lost the empire, and what is it to be British being a medium-sized country in the European Union, of no particular grandeur. But France has a bigger navy than we have these days, and they can bomb Libya much more seriously than Britain can. And Britain won't be able to fight any serious war for 10 years because of the cuts in defence spending, all this kind of rubbish. And you have this in Russia on a much bigger scale, so huge production of articles, books, and so on these issues. And Filipov goes on, therefore both the recognition of sovereignty and its denial are not simply rhetorical figures. The question is of political communication, which proposes that the consolidation of political agents, whether they're citizens, official institutions, representatives of self-organisation, other significant figures, proposes the consolidation of sovereignty. This means that any really consolidated we as a political or politically relevant unity in final analysis, without exception, which could appear as the subject source of the decision, must in defined circumstances in general speak of the decision, not the depersonalised force of circumstances and events. So it's exactly this question of subjectivity in politics, which I referred to already, which you hear from Zorkin, the head of the Constitutional Court. They are all feeding from the same trough, if you like. So these are the ideas buzzing around, which work themselves out in the official state doctrine of sovereign democracy. For the German in this room, Schmitt has also translated into Russian an article by Schmitt which has not yet appeared in English. It's Gespräch über die Macht und den Zugang zum Machthaber, which I think means discussion on power and access to the power holder, or something of that order. So this is now in Russian, although it isn't in English yet. And that came out of a philosophical journal called Blue Divan, Sini Divan, which doesn't come out anymore, it's quite interesting. Another young conservative who you can watch on YouTube, and is in the book, is Mikhail Remizov, born 1978, and he's now the president of the Institute of National Strategy that was founded by Stanislas Belkovsky. And in 2011, he published an article. If anyone wants it, I'll send you the text of this lecture with a lot of references. And I've just spent too much of my time reading stuff written by these people. And particularly in a website called Ruski Journal, Russian journal, where every day there are new articles published by people from the circle. And it's called A Collection of Superstitions, the Nationalisms of the Ruling Class. He accuses the ruling elite of Russia of having no joined-up conception of national ethnic policy, but only a collection of superstitions handed down from the Soviet time, which makes the approach of the state to the national ethnic sphere completely contradictory. Because in Russia you have 83 subjects of the Federation, 21 of which are ethnic republics, like Chechnya, Ingushetia, and so on, named after the ethnicity who live in that territory, Tatarstan being the most powerful. So he identifies a number of contradictions. First one is between the idea of a united political nation and the principle of a multinational ethnic state. Second, between the status and the state of national ethnic minorities and the absence of an analogical status for the national ethnic majority. This is at the heart. I don't know if you saw at the turn of the year, there was a huge riot right in the centre of Moscow, in the Manege, next to Red Square, by ultra-right. A completely racist riot with flares and God knows what. He adds in the Russian Federation, there is no form of self-determination for Russians, as opposed to Chechnya for the Chechens, Tatarstan for the Tatars, etc. He says, when power has a transcendental source of legitimacy, it can permit itself to play with multinationalism, and its point of support in general is above the nation. The problem of Russian power consists in the fact that it has lost its highest point of support but kept multinationalism as a principle. Precisely that principle blocks the democratic evolution of Russian power. Again, you have to understand that democratic has a different meaning than you would normally have. There's a key article, if you're into this kind of thing, 2008. Remizov wrote an article called Why We Are Conservatives. So if you just bear with me, I'm almost done. And I think you will find this interesting. So he defines his position as follows, why we are conservatives. He says Marxism was sharpened against another enemy, against liberalism, that is in some way against the market, elevated to the rank of ideology. But conservatism is the alternative to Marxism, ideology of limiting the market. In his view, the Marxist critique of conservatism was vulgar rather than scientific. He admits that fascism has nothing in common with conservatism, but, he says, quote, if one has in mind classical Italian fascism, so I kept this for you since you're here in Turin. If you have in mind classical Italian fascism and not Hitler's racial experiment, then, by and large, it represented nothing other than the unification of conservative thought with futuristic ethics and the methods of street terror. I rest my case, really. So, what you have at the centre of the Russian young conservatives and the ideology of the state now, they think Italian fascism was a jolly good thing. So, really. And the proper alternative to Marxism. So he says the fundamental concept is inheritance. He says each of the three great ideologies, liberal, Marxist and conservative, has its own basis for demanding power. In the liberal model, taxes are the basis. Quote, we pay taxes, consequently we can make demands on those who spend them. That's liberalism. For the Marxists, this role is played by surplus value. The state as agent for capital lives off the surplus product created by our labour. According to conservative logic, demand on the state is based on the fact that it disposes of a shared inheritance directly or by defining the rules for its use. And he finishes, we present our bill to the contemporary state, not because we are taxpayers, and not because we are labourers, but because we are inheritors, therefore we are conservatives. So, there you go. I did bring along with me, I won't probably look at really, the latest piece from Zorkin et al. This was in the Kommersant newspaper on the 17th of May, just a couple of days ago. And this is Zorkin, who has placed national law above, he's placed international law under national law. And what's significant here is that this is a conference on the Nuremberg trials, where the Speaker of the Upper House of Parliament, the Federation Council, Sergei Mironov, and Valery Zorkin, the head of the Constitutional Court, and the Minister of Justice, Alexander Konovalov, were united in saying we've got to defy international law, both human rights law and humanitarian law. And where I slightly agree with them, I can ask questions about this, is there's just been a terribly bad case in the European Court of Human Rights called Kononov against Latvia. He won in the chamber, lost in the Grand Chamber, you've probably heard of this case. And he's a red partisan, Latvian, actually born in Latvia. He was fighting the Nazis during the Second World War. And the Latvian state, which supports on the 16th of March each year the march of the Latvian Legion, they're the Latvians who fought with the Waffen-SS and exterminated Jews during the Second World War. They prosecuted him for war crimes, and the majority of the European Court of Human Rights upheld that conviction for things he's alleged to have done in 1944, before international law crystallised at Nuremberg. So on that one, that's the only point where I think I agree with this one. So I would love to have some questions, please. Thank you for being attentive. The reason I don't use PowerPoint is I can't bear people looking behind my shoulder all the time. Plus, I can't then look into your eyes to see whether, I think you're getting a point. So, yeah. So you know, obviously, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Carlos, I teach at Berkeley Law School, various summer teaching incentives and regular.
Right.
So this is really rich and informative, so thanks very much. I guess two questions. One is, I think to some extent, right, your talk is mainly descriptive in the sense of gathering a bunch of texts and legal events and other political events in order to coalesce into some analysis of an incipient ideological formation, let's say. And I want to try to figure out if I've got right what your understanding of the constituent features of the ideology are.
Yeah.
So that's a descriptive question.
Yeah.
Then there's another question, which is, unless I missed it,
Yeah.
I'm not sure you're committing yourself to any analysis, critical or otherwise, of the ideology. So there's a lot of, Moose Student wrote this, they're citing Schmidt. They're all citing Schmidt. But there's no actual, right, we're not engaging critically and saying, so these are some of the problematic, either analytical or political components. So if I might be right on that component, that's what I'd also like to ask. But let me first ask on the descriptive component. So I'm probably butchering this, but I understood you to say that the radical conservative ideology has basically three constituent features. One is the subjectivity of the sovereign or the state or the political or the democratic. Two, a Schmittian conception of the sovereign's structure of power and legitimacy. Three, the legitimacy being rooted in some ethno-Eurasian project. Is that roughly right?
That parts of it, yes. I mean, I think where some of them end up is with the, well, to me it's quite bizarre, in a polity which is as multi-ethnic really as probably as it could be. So, this idea of Russia for the Russians, fine. So they end up in that kind of, and you've got to squash the, and by the way, the Tatars were there before the Russians were, and, Russia was Muslim before it was Orthodox, etc. So, yeah, that's part of it, for sure. And, shall I continue or do you want to ask further? Yeah, okay. So, you're quite right in a sense. So what I've given you is a bit of a detective story. So I was very, very curious, and I think this is a good way to start always. Then how you conceptualize it, actually, Now, my starting point is always that any theory about Russia is always wrong. And I think this has always been the case. A reason is because the place is so complex and, large, it's the cliche, etc., etc. And also the history is, one side of the history is that Russia and Britain have always been friends, by the way, with the exception of the Crimean War. So the empires grew, but grew in parallel quite happily, because the British was a sea empire and the Russians was a land empire. So you have existential questions, of course, but I think Russia has the bitter memories. Britain doesn't have a wonderful history in many ways, but I think in Russia to have suffered losing so many people in the Second World War, plus Stalin, so every family lost people. And so you have fantastically, read Boris Gross on this, and people, there are various people, tremendously complicated ideas that people have as to who they are and where they come from and that kind of thing. And at one level, this so-called debate between Slavophiles and Westernizers, so as if there's a complete dichotomy between a kind of Russian idea, a deep philosophical, ethical kind of idea, and the West as sort of individualist and mechanistic and all the rest of it. And what interests me greatly is why you have this particular move in the past 10 years. So I think what you didn't mention is decisionism. So I think the subjectivity is very, very important, of course, and that's what Remizov draws out. But I think the sovereignty as a political choice, as decisionism.
That's what I meant by a Schmittian conception of the sovereign source.
Yes, right. Yeah. So they don't go into, nobody talks about the set of exception. I don't see a Gambon discussed a huge amount. But I think these are classically Schmittian moves, by the way, in the sense of what's presently happening in Russia. And one of the things that was very disturbing, I thought, with the race riots at the turn of the year, was that Putin and Medvedev immediately moved to support, apparently, the rioters. So both of them seem to have this kind of an agenda. No, I've been thrown out of Russia twice, in 2005 and 2007, got back in. So I've been teaching at Nina's place just recently and various other things, so don't let me back. It's massively complicated. It's not, it is authoritarian. I think the basic feature is kleptocracy at the sort of beginning, so I think corruption. But it's corruption plus. So you have massively corrupt people whose personal principle is to stay in power come what may, and they have to stay in power, obviously. So, and to steal as much as they possibly can. But this is not the only state of that kind, by the way, so there are others as well. Plus, this ideology, which I don't think is, so if what I'm telling you is not as analytical as it might be, I think it's because what's coming out of there is not as analytical as it might be. So, for me, makes it, in many ways, more interesting. But the book is meant to, the text is meant to be with the publishers October next year, so I hope that by October next year I'll have a worked out theory. You can read all manner of rubbish about it, published by good scholars.
What sort of counter moves are happening?
I'm sorry?
What sort of counter moves are happening? So this is sweeping through and gaining traction. What's the effort to stop it or to propose an alternative, or where are those people?
Disastrous. Because, well, so if you take, so I'll tell you some good things and some bad things. I think what is very bad is what they call political technology in Russia, which is one of the ways that the state defends itself is by creating simulacra of oppositions. And so when you see an opposition in Russia, your first guess is it's been created by the Kremlin. And it's what Andrew Wilson describes as virtual politics, which is completely detached from the ordinary lives of most people, which are spent watching game shows on television. So television is state controlled, and there's minimal politics on television. So that is part of it. I think another part of it, though, is the internet, which the state has not managed to control so far. It's huge and growing all the time, exponentially. And politically, periodically there are great, well not great, but I mean significant bursts of protest in many parts of Russia over quite often, totally unexpected issues, coordinated through Twitter and Facebook and Live Journal and this kind of thing. And you do have, I think, the human rights movement, which they're the people I see all the time. An interesting fact to me is that in Britain, human rights people are mainly left-wing. In Russia, they are mainly right-wing. So, because they were people who came out of the liberal dissidents, so their philosophy will be liberal in individualism and that. Whereas in Britain, to a certain extent, the States, people come from slightly different formations. So I find that interesting. But I think the human rights people, they are regarded as being foreign agents. That is the propaganda of the state, that they are paid from abroad. It's true, they are. So they must be anti-Russian, and etc., etc. So that is more or less bought. The environmental movement is very interesting. So recently there's been a big battle over the forest to the north of Moscow, where the authorities want to drive a huge road through. And a very interesting environmental movement which has thrown up a young woman who's a tremendous leader, Chirikova, who's really, has come from nowhere and is tremendous. You can watch her on YouTube as well. And with anarchists, significant anarchists. So there's a wonderful film you can see on YouTube where several hundred anarchists take over the center of the city of Khimki. And it's called pogrom in Russian. And so there's a pogrom where they attack with rocks and all manner of things the administration building. And the police are just not there. You think, where are the police? And then the police do arrive, due course, and rough people up and so on. But that takes you to the anti-Fa movement, the anti-fascists. That is actually quite well organised. So through the internet, so you have anti-Fa, and these are young people, like in Greece or like in Italy, who go to the streets, to contest the far right. So you do have that. I would say the example of Kremlin technology is the Other Russia, which you might have heard of, which is the most bizarre formation. It is Kasyanov, the former prime minister, who is totally corrupt, Kasparov, the former chess champion, and Limonov, the leader of the National Bolshevik Party, which is actually a fascist, neo-fascist party. Their flag is the red flag with a hammer and sickle instead of the swastika. And they attract a lot of young people on the basis of direct action. And then they are meant to be the opposition to the Kremlin, for heaven's sake. So I'm 100% convinced that they are paid by the Kremlin. I mean, what other explanation is there? This means that it is incredibly difficult to get in. I personally think the Communist Party has to split. The Communist Party is a nationalist party, as it stands, although there are good people in it. There is no social democratic party in Russia, though there have been attempts to get one started. And the far left is lots and lots of sectarian groups. Very busy, but I wouldn't say any particular resonance. So it's quite bad. That kind of thing. But I think the internet is great.
Follow up one more question.
Yeah.
So just because it's a political economy thing we do, in your story, the story I hear is we do religion, not politics, because, and the story that comes out is Western liberalism is decadent, corrupt, so we get this, it's a very culture, it's a culture critique, it's a religion critique, her skirt's too short, we need orthodoxy or something. But my question is, in that account, it becomes like a story of the clash of cultures.
Huntington is ever so popular in Russia.
Right. Well, that's how it's depicted, and out of that comes this like religious, and you use that as a way to explain this, what you call a resurgence of this orthodoxy or Byzantium.
I'd say it's one of the sources.
Right. It's the source that I see come out tonight. Here's my question. So, where does that, another one of those sources, another source has to be the fact of the failure of the quote-unquote transithology period.
Yeah.
So it looks like a neo-fascism rising up because, the markets didn't do what they were supposed to do, and people are respect fascism comes out of a liberal project, economic project. So where is that the case in this account, or is that just overly simplified? Is it something else?
Well, one reason I'm spending time in libraries in Moscow digging up Pachikana stuff that hasn't been translated, for example, because I'm very interested also in the ideological debate at the beginning of the Soviet period. So I'm answering your question obliquely, but what I find very, very interesting is that you had 1905, the first revolution, where Trotsky was the leader of the St. Petersburg Soviet and so on and so forth. That was put down very brutally. 1909, there's a collection of essays that's just being reprinted in paperback, or Vieki, I've just been reading it, which was the religious liberal arguments against the socialists and Marxists, and people like Peter Struve, Belyaeva, so if you're at all into this kind of stuff, these are names which are quite significant. Kistiakovsky, who was the main proponent of rule of law and rights at that time. So what I mean to say is a very lively debate, but conducted in many ways on kind of religious lines, and I think this is very characteristic of Russia. Then you have the initial period of kind of state atheism in the Soviet Union. And then Stalin, in order to win the Second World War, had to co-opt the Orthodox Church. And so from the Second World War onwards, the Orthodox Church became very rich and controlled by the KGB, but as it still is, and quite very powerful in Russia. And Stalin, who was trained in a seminary, has anyone here had the pleasure of reading his work? So I have. He wrote in a very religious style. Stalin's favorite style was the catechism. So his famous speech after Lenin's death is a religious catechism. Just read it. It's with repetitious phrases and everything that you have in a catechism. So in the Soviet period, and Pachikanis, by the way, became an out-and-out Stalinist before he was murdered by the Stalinists. So this is the irony of many, many people. So I think that again is part of it. Now, if you ask me, do I have a completely worked out theory? No, so I'm working on it. The more I get into it, the more interesting I do find it. It's probably true of any field of study, I guess. Are you a political scientist, by the way? Are you? Sorry, I've got your name. No. Are you a legal theorist? Yeah. So I spent time with ethno-nationalists and political scientists of various kinds and philosophers, and this, I think it's quite interesting also.
So my question is, you paint this rather kind of bleak picture of an insular, Schmittian, nationalistic Russian state, and yet you bring all these cases to the European Court of Human Rights, right? And so my question for you is, A, what do you think is the awareness of the European Court of Human Rights of this situation there? Do they have a strategy towards this? And what's your strategy by going to them?
Fantastic question. So, number one, strangely enough, though they are losing cases every day, they always cough up. So at the moment, there's a declaration that the certain rights have been violated and they're ordered to pay damages. They always pay, even in cases where they're extremely angry about it, about the decision. On the awareness, actually, in Britain, most people think the European Court of Human Rights is part of the European Union. Even serious newspapers think that. And therefore, because most people in Britain want to get out of the European Union, they also want to get out of what they perceive to be part of it. Russia, actually, I would say most people know about Strasbourg. Every lawyer knows about Strasbourg. And the reason why the 1/3 of all applications from 47 countries are now coming from Russia is because every lawyer in Russia says to their client, okay, you've lost, don't worry, we're going to Strasbourg. So 98% of applications from Russia go in the bin, either immediately or over the course of a few years. But the awareness of it is there, and it's constantly talked about, it's constantly in the media. And now the court is beginning to impose on Russia not simply payment of damages, but also they have to do certain things. And so I mentioned some of the controversial cases, there are more. Why do we take it? Okay, the other side of the question.
Well, the question was, what is the awareness of the court of the situation inside Russia, not the awareness of Russia?
Well, I think if you ask most people in Russia, they will say they're all thieves. So I think the general perception is that they are living indeed in a kleptocracy.
No, but what's the awareness of the court?
Of the court?
No, of the court of Russia.
of the
the political situation in Russia.
political situation.
Like, do you think the court is politically savvy enough?
Oh, well, they're not dealing with, don't forget, the European Convention on Human Rights is the French Declaration of 1789, basically. And it is a very conservative document. And, conservatives in Britain say, actually, there's nothing in the convention we disagree with, it's conservative philosophy. So when you get anything through the convention, it's by dint of, being, and the court is intensely uncomfortable with dealing with issues like the Kurdish struggle or the Chechens, and the court always wants to deal with it as if it were one individual, when you had 3.5 million people displaced in southeastern Turkey. But the court heard a couple of hundred village destruction cases. And the court has heard, if I told you the facts of the first 6 Chechen cases, they are horrifying. And actually the facts found by the court amount to findings of war crimes by named Russian officers who have since been promoted. And there's a marvellous people in Russia who do a lot of work to try and publicise, and they get prosecuted and killed as well. At the end of the day, you ask me why. Well, first of all, I have a complicated theory set out in my book as to why there is symbolic capital dating from 1789 in the convention. So there is, in a sense, when it's picked up, and this is Patricia Williams' thesis of it as well, but when people pick it up and run with it, they put new life into it, and I think that happens. I think also, at another level, for the Chechen applicants, for example, the government lies completely about what's happening to them. So, one of the first 6 cases is women whose children were killed when the Russian Air Force bombed a civilian convoy, which they had said was leaving on a safe road out of Grozny, before Grozny was smashed to the ground. And the Russians totally denied that any such thing had happened. And what was extremely important for the applicants was to have, their truth vindicated at a level where it could not be contradicted. And so those judgments have been translated into Russian, Chechen. They're very, I know you wrote them. By the way, the judges don't write the judgments in Strasbourg. They're written by the court lawyers. And this was written by Olga Chernyshova, who is brilliant. And, this then becomes part of the capital of the, not only the Chechens, but all of the suppressed people in Russia. So I think from that point of view, it has significance. So it's not simply, going to your local courts and getting some decision. So, and the environmental cases, we're taking them in the context of a closed city. And there are still quite a few closed cities in Russia with a barbed wire around them and everything. The people who are born in them are treated as walking state secrets. We have a lot of cases coming out of a nuclear Chernobyl-type disaster in 1957, where we still have the consequences. And I'm representing a number of adults who were in their mothers' wombs when the disaster happened, and their mothers were forced to take part in the cleanup even though pregnant. And what the people suffered and what treatment they had is state secrets. So, Russia is different in that sense, and I think it has significance in taking these kind of cases. But I do have, all the time I worry, what the hell do we think we're doing? Because at one level it is some kind of cultural imperialism.
At some point you mentioned that Russia actually did get some of the French Enlightenment values sometime in the 18th century. Did that just die off, or is it, or has it taken a new form, or maybe it's even being used by the left in this circumstance?
Yeah, so I think that there are at least two strains in Russia. So one of the major Russian thinkers around the time of the French Revolution was Radishev, who wrote a book called A Journey from Moscow to St. Petersburg, which is absolutely full of enlightenment, sort of kind of writes a man. Actually, Radishev is the Russian Thomas Paine, so it's very similar, and it reads quite contemporary in the way that Thomas Paine reads quite contemporary in Britain. And Tolstoy, in his own way, and there's a whole lot of people, and many of the human rights characters. The leading fellow in Russia is called Sergei Adamovich Kovalyov, who's still alive. He spent 11 years in hard labor camp, in the Soviet period for trying to start the first branch in the Soviet Union of Amnesty International. And he was prosecuted for anti-Soviet activity. And he's the president of Memorial. He was the first Russian ombudsman at the time of the First Chechen War, appointed by Yeltsin. Yeltsin thought he was his man because he was a liberal and against the communists and that kind of thing. But then Kovalyov got involved, and there was a famous occasion at a town called Budyonnovsk, where the Chechen jihadist leader Shamil Basayev, who's dead now, but was responsible for the Beslan and Nordost nightmares. And he occupied a school, so it was like kind of Beslan, except he then put a whole lot of hostages into buses to get away with his men. And Kovalyov and Oleg Orlov, who's the head of the Human Rights Department, they volunteered to be hostages. I mean, these are quite amazing people. I mean, I totally disagree with. Kovalyov is 100% liberal, big L and small L, so I argue with him to the extent that I can. But he's a kind of like an Old Testament prophet, and he's a true follower of Tolstoy, so it's that kind of anarchism in a way with him. And there are quite remarkable people of that kind. I have to say, you don't find them in the Communist Party. So.
Hypocrisy and corruption really are terms that are often have a problem with when describing Russia. Because for me, it connotates this idea that there's some straight course that's well defined, and somehow Russia has derailed from it and needs to be rerouted to follow this course. And I think it's a very different case because, as you've described, the history is extremely important in developing the system. So I'm wondering, a lot of the solutions you propose or ideas for a reaction to this conservative movement is external. And how much, if you try to force Russia to adhere to these new policies, how can you be certain that it won't, as a reaction to that, fuel the conservative?
So I put my cards on the table. So I think foreign pressure is terrible, by the way. And I think Madeleine Albright, Condoleezza Rice, and now Hillary Clinton, it's totally counterproductive. I think this kind of. So I think Russia has to do what it does, and it will work it out for itself. So plus, I firmly believe that there has to be a strong Russia. So with that, I'm totally with Putin, by the way. So on that, I completely agree with him, because I think a world in which you have one or two really strong powers, and Russia ought to be a really strong power. I think the cleverest politician in Russia is Mr. Lavrov, the foreign minister. And stuff is being written by foreign policy analysts saying actually Russia has played a weak hand really quite strongly. They've screwed up over Libya. I think they got that one wrong. And they've probably screwed up over Georgia, though they recently won in the International Court of Justice, which they're quite pleased about. So, on those, I think I agree with you. I think foreign pressure is the wrong thing, and I think a serious weakness of as I was saying earlier, of the human rights movement is the fact that money comes from abroad. Part of the problem is that rich Russians, if they try to put money into that kind of thing, they end up like Mr. Khodorkovsky in prison. On kleptocracy, I don't think Russia is the only one. So it's fairly standard for a country at that stage of development. It's not a word I hate, but whatever that means. But I think you can find a number of states in different parts of the world which are as authoritarian and as corrupt. So I don't say this is necessarily a particularly Russian thing. But I do think in a system where the whole of the public administration is totally corrupt, where everything has its price, and they publish in the newspapers how much you have to pay to get off every kind of crime, up to and including murder. It's reached that kind of point. And I'll just illustrate with one small example that this moved some years back in Krasnodar Krai, which is the Black Sea coast of Russia and the main holiday resort area of Russia, kind of subtropical, and where the Winter Olympics are going to be. And they have the Supreme Court of that part of Russia, headed by a very clever lawyer called Mikhail Chernov, Judge Chernov, So everyone knows what his salary is, and it's not huge. He drives Mercedes and BMWs, and he's got several. He has a Rolex watch, or several, Armani and Hugo Boss suits, several bodyguards at any one time, a number of houses, and a newspaper which dared to publish. All they did was say, here is Mr. Chernoff, here is his salary, here are pictures of the watches, the suits, the cars, the bodyguards, the houses, and the way the man lives. Now, and he sued them, and he said, I'm confident that my brother and sister judges will do the right thing. And he won his case and was awarded $1.5 million against the Novaya Gazeta newspaper. It's a notorious case. And he is not this is not from taking bribes. So he doesn't bother to take bribes. He is part of the criminal structure of Krasnodar crime, so which the police are also part of, as are the prosecutors, and everyone is getting their cut. So you can work it out, actually. How much money is being generated by the mafia. So, you can see the same thing in Sicily, by the way, so, or other parts of Italy. Same kind of thing. So I'm not saying Russia's particular. There are plenty of people trying to fight it. But when you have the whole system is geared to generating, kickbacks at all levels, it's called karnushka. So when you would, karnushka means feeding trough. And it means when you get a job in Russia, the karnushka, you have the regular salary, and then there's the karnushka. So I'll give you one other small example. I was doing work on disabled reform of social services in Russia, and we were working with the Department for Disability, headed by a medical doctor, quite effective guy, but he was going on holiday in Club Med several times a year, was wearing clothes that he bought in Selfridges in London, etc. And I knew how much he was earning, and it certainly didn't stretch that. Then it turns out he owns a number of factories making artificial limbs, which are then sold to his ministry. And he's in charge now. In Russia, that's normal. So this is how he affords this lifestyle. So the Russians have this sorted out, by the way. I don't think the Americans or the British or anybody else should be doing it. And when they joined the European Convention on Human Rights, that is actually quite complicated process, but in fact the communists and nationalists overwhelmingly voted in favour of joining it, actually. I've written a couple of articles on that. So as to why that might be this. So there you go.
Hey, thank you so much.
Yeah.
For the rest of the game.